All right, everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for joining. My name is Maya Schonbach. I am a clinical psychologist and I work here at Trickstop. Today, we're gonna start talking about the connection between trauma and hair pulling. We'll talk a little bit about what we know, things that we're still in the field that we're still learning, exploring. We'll get into the nervous system, emotions, your personal history, how all of these things can play a role. Um, and really, there's a lot of ideas out there about trichotillomania and trauma. Some are helpful, some are confusing. And so this session is really about looking at the evidence, challenging misconceptions that there might be. We'll try to clarify some things and really just validate what is important to look at. Um, I encourage you guys to stay until the end because there's going to be a discount for joining Trickstop. So let's get started. Okay, so before we dive into the theory or the data, let's look at what we're going to talk about today. So we'll start with kind of some myths and facts about what things people often believe, and then we'll go into defining our terms. So what's trauma? We'll look at the nervous system and the body, more emotion triggers. We'll look at the latest research, and then we'll look at some practical treatment relevant takeaways that you can have for what healing really can look like. Oh, sorry, very important to mention. We'll do a Q&A together all at the end of the session. So whenever you have a question, a comment, a thought, please share. I love hearing this. And write it into the chat. And then at the end, I'll go through them all together and you'll have time to ask some more questions if you think. So let's get started. So let's start with some talking about some of the biggest myths that there are out there. So these are things that show up in the therapy office, things that you might see on social media, things that even come up in research settings. And honestly, a lot of these things don't really hold up when we dive in deeper. So we'll look at some of these claims and then try to replace them with some evidence in the session today. Okay, let's start with a big one. What do you think? You can write it in if you want to. You can just think to yourself. Trauma causes trichotillomania. What do you think? Is this based in evidence? Think to yourself, yes, no. So it's a myth because it's not that simple. So a lot of people are told that their behaviors must be the result of some trauma. So for some, that could be true, but for many others, it's just simply not related. So what research shows is that trauma can influence how we regulate, how we soothe, and then sometimes we'll talk about this later, but hair pulling can become a tool for managing that. So it's not always about trauma that happened in the past, but more so things that of like a pattern that we develop to feel okay right now in the present. That's kind of how we'll talk about this. Okay, myth or fact? Trichotillomania is a form of self-harm. So this is a big one that brings up strong feelings for a lot of people, especially if you've maybe been misunderstood by others. So what do you think? Is trichotillomania maybe self-injury, like under a different name? Write into the chat if you want to, or think to yourself. So again, it's a myth. Trichotillomania is not self-harm. So this is really important to debunk because the difference here is really the intent. The intent behind trichotillomania, it's typically about something soothing. It's typically not to punish yourself. We look at it more like a coping behavior as opposed to something that's self-destructive. And that difference is really, really important. It really matters, especially when you're in therapy, to differentiate between those two. Next, myth or fact. You might have heard that pulling your hair means you must be dealing with unresolved trauma. So everyone with trichotillomania has unresolved trauma. Is that actually true? What do you think? Myth or fact? So again, this one's also a myth because really many people with trichotillomania have no trauma at all. So this belief can actually be harmful because sometimes people could feel pressured to maybe find a trauma that they don't actually connect to it. And then that can get in the way of actually receiving real treatment. And what I really want to emphasize and underscore here is that trichotillomania is valid with or without trauma. So yeah, so it's really important to see that many people with trichotillomania grew up in safe, loving homes, and also there's no universal trauma pattern for people with trichotillomania. We'll look into this more in the research, but there's people with emotional abuse, there's people with one-time events, with chronic trauma. Um, there's people that don't identify with any of this. So again, that's very important. And the last one, let's look at function, not just cause. So what role does pulling actually serve in the moment? Is it something that um, helps people regulate emotions? What do you think? Somebody did a thumbs up. I like that. You're right. It's a fact. This one's true. We typically look how we often understand hair pulling as a strategy to regulate your emotions. And it's really one of the most helpful ways to kind of reframe it like this, because pulling is something that often helps people feel calmer, more focused, maybe more in control. So it's really healing isn't just about stopping the behavior, it's about understanding what it does for the person. And then if we look at it as a coping mechanism, an emotional regulation strategy, we can understand it's not the best one. And maybe it's important to learn new tools. So this is it can help you, especially when you don't have other tools that are available. And so that's what we do in our program. And that's what you can do with a therapist, is to learn different ways to cope with your emotions. All right. So we talked a little bit about some myths and facts. Let's get into it. What is trauma? So let's start with the definition from the APA, or the American Psychological Association. So they say trauma is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings that are intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. So traumatic events include those caused by human behavior as well as by nature, and they often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that trauma isn't just about something that already happened, or it's about it's about how the experience affected somebody over time. So it includes not just the event itself, but also the internal response. So, like they said, the fear, right? The helplessness, the dissociation, the confusion, and then the disruption to your functioning or to your worldview. And then when they say it can come from both human actions, so things like abuse or violence, but also things like natural events, earthquakes, tsunamis. Um, and really the big important thing here is that what makes something traumatic isn't just the event, but it's really the psychological impact that it leaves behind. That's kind of the key thing for the definition of trauma. So let's dig into this idea a little bit more. So trauma isn't just what happened, It's again how that experience was processed by your nervous system, by you. So things like a distressing event, so things like maybe a fight or hearing a really harsh comment or a medical procedure, um, these things aren't automatically considered as trauma. It happens when trauma occurs when something overwhelms your capacity or your ability to cope and to regulate yourself. And then it's important to say that yeah, so how your body and mind copes with it, so it processes it, stores it, and then also to respond to it. And then it's also important to say that one person might experience an event and move through it, and maybe they'll have support, or maybe they'll just have different coping mechanisms, and they'll move through the event, while another person might go through the exact same event and store it or process it in their body in a way that really disrupts how they feel, they behave, or trust the world. And that, as we just saw with the APA definition, that is it by definition trauma. So really this helps us, this is another key thing, is this helps us move away from labeling people based on events, um, instead of labeling this as a weakness, and instead moving towards understanding that it's about overwhelm. It's a way to help us meet the person where they are with compassion, with curiosity, and to be there to help them. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit. So trauma doesn't always show up in memories. It often lives in the body. So how does that look like? It could be something called hypervigilance. I will talk about also a little bit later. But maybe feeling on edge. It could also be feeling numb or totally checked out. Um, you could have flashbacks, or you could also avoid certain things that are associated with a certain event, or having very big emotional swings. And these are all potential signs of trauma that's being held in the nervous system. Um, and again, these aren't just memories or just random occurrences. They're an embodied response. It's your body's way of responding to something that happened and that overwhelmed your nervous system. And so this is also part of why trauma can be hard to identify, because it's not always just about remembering a big event. Sometimes you really have to sit and notice how your body is reacting to the world around you right now. And yes, it's definitely important to see that trauma overlaps with things like dissociation or emotional reactivity. Those are elements of it, but it's not the whole picture. Okay, so not all trauma also looks the same. This is important. Saying everything's important. Okay, so not all trauma looks the same. And also not all of it comes from one extreme or dramatic event. So we can look at how different types of trauma then change how we regulate our emotions and then relate to our bodies and then cope with, be it with hair pulling, be it with other coping mechanisms. Okay, so acute trauma. Acute trauma comes from a one-time event. So something like a car accident or maybe a medical procedure or a sudden loss. Something that, again, overwhelms the nervous system in one single blow. Then there's something that is called chronic trauma, that builds slowly over time. So it's something that could be like living with ongoing bullying, coming from an unstable home, having chronic illness. And then there's things like developmental or relational trauma that they can happen when maybe your caregiver was misattuned, unavailable, emotionally unpredictable. And these kinds of trauma often impact how our ability to to feel safe in our bodies or really to know what we need inside. Um, and then these different distinctions of trauma really matter because people with trichotillomania, they might not always recognize their experiences as trauma, especially if nothing quote unquote big happened. Sometimes it's really the slow, subtle, or repeated experiences that really shape how we cope and our coping patterns the most. So they can all really affect our emotion regulation and our identity. And again, this is very important that we're not talking about this to label or to pathologize. It's really to understand the context um, that can help us be more compassionate, both to others, but also to ourselves. Okay, so let's talk now about two important frameworks that really help us understand trauma, especially when it doesn't come from one single event. So the first one is called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. So these include things like growing up maybe around substance abuse, emotional neglect, instability in the home, and these experiences don't always maybe look like trauma in the traditional sense, but again, they can really shape how a developing brain and a developing body respond to stress. So again, not everyone with ACEs is traumatized, but it again can impact how we cope. Um, And then that brings us to another phrase that's really helpful to understand trauma is too much, too fast, too soon. So trauma isn't, again, always about what happened. It's about what overwhelmed the nervous system too much, too fast, too soon before we had the ability to process it. So maybe think about a child who just had too much responsibility too early on in their lives, or somebody who went through a severe situation, a really severe breakup, a really severe illness, maybe at a time that they just didn't have support. And so again, it's about what was missing as much as what happened. So it really, again, we're trying to depathologize. We're not trying to blame the parents in the past or dig up the past. We're trying to understand what the nervous system experienced as overwhelming, as too much, and then to see what it might be trying to manage right now. And then for people with trichotillomania, that unresolved stress really can show up as emotional sensitivity or difficulty regulating their emotions. And then to have this this urge to have this repetitive behavior to bring some sense of relief or feel a sense of grounding. Okay, so that brings us to this. So why does any of this matter in the context of trichotillomania? So really what we've seen so far is that trauma doesn't cause trichotillomania, but for some people, it creates almost what we like to say an internal landscape that makes behaviors like hair pulling um, more likely to develop and stick. And again, that's why is that? That's because trauma can impact how we feel our emotions, how we regulate them, how we stay present in our bodies, so our self-image, our connection to our body, and then also how we cope with things when they feel overwhelming, how we our impulse control. And these are all key areas where trichotillomania can often really shows up in those exact spaces as a tool to manage or to regulate when somebody doesn't have other strategies, they weren't available, they weren't safe, they weren't modeled. So again, no, trauma isn't always part of the story, but when it is, again, we're saying it's not about blame, it's understanding why the body and the brain might turn to something like hair pulling as a coping mechanism in the first place. Why is it like that? And then now, okay, so that'll bring us to the next section. So if trauma lives in the body, what does that mean? How does that look like? How can we use the body to understand and to work on healing. Because really, this is the nervous system and the body is where so much of trauma and regulation they live. So to understand how the nervous system works can kind of help us make sense of why pulling can feel either automatic or feel soothing or really is even necessary to some people. Okay, so we all have something that we call like an internal control center or an internal regulator, and that's our nervous system. And what that does is it's constantly scanning for safety or for danger. And when it's regulated, um, we feel grounded, we feel connected, and we're able to choose how we respond to situations or to things. But when it's overwhelmed, we shift into a survival state. It affects how we think, how we feel, how we cope. And really, that's where behaviors like hair pulling can come in when the nervous system is overwhelmed. Okay, so this is a very important concept called the window of tolerance. And it really helps us to kind of conceptualize and understand um, how we react to stress. So the window of tolerance is something created by Dan Siegel, who was a clinical professor of psychiatry. And it's a model founded in neuroscience, or which is the scientific study of the nervous system. Um, and essentially what it says is that when we're inside this window, I feel like you see my mouse weirdly, in this window, um, we feel calm, we feel focused, we feel present, connected. But if there is too much stress, which could be from unresolved trauma, it pushes us either above the window or below the window. So above the window, that pushes us into a state of hyperarousal. So feeling um, anxiety, having racing thoughts, feeling overwhelmed, or having too much stress, um, again, or unresolved trauma could push us into hypoarousal. And there, that's feeling like shut down, you're numb, frozen. And what's interesting is that trichotillomania or hair pulling can really come up in both of these states. So both in hyper and hypoarousal as a way of trying to regulate what's either too much or too little. And to try, it's always about getting your nervous system back into the window of tolerance and back into balance, kind of. So again, you might notice pulling when you're kind of wired and overwhelmed. So that's in the hyper arousal. So you're feeling restless, panicky, you can't focus. And then in that state, the pulling is there to kind of bring you relief, to help you focus, to maybe escape those feelings. Um, or you might notice the pulling when um, you feel totally blank. That's in the hypoarousal. When you're feeling flat, numb, checked out. And then here, the pulling is maybe as a way to bring some sort of sensation, just to feel something, to stimulate yourself, maybe to ground yourself. And then again, in both cases, this is important, pulling isn't random. Pulling isn't random. It's the body's way of doing something, anything. Help me, give me something to do. That's our nervous system talking to us. Help me shift back into balance. Help me shift back into the window of tolerance. So again, sometimes it's to calm ourselves down if we're in the hyper arousal, shift us back down. Sometimes it's to shift up to feel anything at all. And again, emphasizing this, I'll say this a lot, but we want to understand this to move more into curiosity, not into labeling, pathologizing, judging, but we want to just understand this. Okay. Now let's shift from talking about the nervous system into more of the emotional world. So many people with trichotillomania, they notice specific emotional states that tend to show up either before, during, or after pulling episodes. And so these could be things like feeling stressed, feeling overstimulated, maybe feeling understimulated, boredom. But there's emotional patterns that can also run deeper. Things like chronic perfectionism, social anxiety, feeling of shame around feeling certain things, around your emotions, your shame around your appearance, feeling not enough, feeling too much. And so these emotional cues, they're not the cause of trichotillomania, but they can kind of set the stage for the pulling. And so here is where trauma could enter the picture. So for people with trauma history, the brain might be kind of wired to look for some form of control, especially over the body. And then trichotillomania can become a strategy to manage that. So again, a way to maybe feel something, anything when you're feeling numb, or maybe to fix what looks or maybe what feels wrong. If there's like a hair that feels out of place, maybe to fix that feeling. So again, that doesn't mean that trauma caused the behavior, but again, it might explain or help explain why the behavior feels so compelling. The urge is so strong. We have so many clients that say, I just have to do it. I need to do it. So maybe that trauma could explain that. Okay, so now just for a moment, I want you guys to take a moment and think about this. What emotional states, even super subtle ones, tend to come right before or right after you're pulling? Maybe there's a moment of tension. Maybe there's an urge to disappear. Maybe there's a critical voice in your head. Just try and be curious, because these are patterns that can really give you really important insight. And again, we're not trying to blame anything, but we're trying to become aware. These are really important reflections to do, especially in therapy. In our program, you work a lot with a therapist on these around this question. Okay, so now that we've explored the emotional and also the physiological aspects of trichotillomania and trauma, let's look at the current research. So what does the data show us about the connection between trauma and hair pulling? Okay, so this is a recent study done in last year, very recent, from Grant and colleagues, and really gives us more clarity about what happens when PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder and trichotillomania show up together. So this was interesting that almost 20% of people with trichotillomania in the study screened positive for PTSD. So that's much higher than the general population, which is a rate of around 4 to 5%. So yes, there is an overlap. But what's crucial here is what the overlap doesn't mean. So here they found that the presence of PTSD was not linked to worse pulling here. not associated with greater pulling severity or impairment, and it didn't lead to more impairment in daily life. Instead, what they found was that the combination of trichotillomania and post-traumatic stress disorder was associated with a higher likelihood of impulsive behaviors. So things like um, gambling, risky sexual behavior, stealing, overeating, things like that. So again, this challenges the idea that trauma makes pulling worse. And it shows that or it suggests that some people maybe they share an impulsivity or emotion regulation vulnerabilities that show up in different ways. And so again, this is really important to show that co-occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder and trichotillomania doesn't mean causality. So trauma, really it's saying that trauma might be part of someone's story, but it's not necessarily the driver of the trichotillomania. Important. Okay, so another interesting study done by Houghton and his colleagues in 2016 found something very important, that there's no direct link between trauma and developing trichotillomania. So in other words, they the trauma didn't predict who pulled their hair or how much they pulled their hair. What they noticed was that people who experienced trauma were more likely to have depressive symptoms. So those depressive symptoms, things like hopelessness, sadness, emotional numbing. So these symptoms were associated with greater trichotillomania severity, so more pulling. So what this is telling us is it's not trauma leading to, I feel like you see my thing. It's not trauma leading to hair pulling. It's more like trauma leading to negative emotion, leading to more pulling. So again, in that case, it's saying that the behavior of pulling might be, again, serving as a coping mechanism, as a strategy, and not the healthiest or the best one, but a strategy or a way to manage the intense, negative, or hard to process feelings or emotions. So again, this study really helps us shift our focus away from trauma as the cause and more towards looking at it as emotion regulation, as being a really key piece of the puzzle of trichotillomania. Okay, so let's look at one more study. So this is done by Lochner and colleagues, a little older, and they looked at dissociation and trichotillomania. So dissociation is the feeling of being detached, feeling in a trance, and how that shows up in people with trichotillomania. So first, they found that almost 1 in 5 people in their study were high dissociators. So that's meaningful. That's a big number. And it aligns with what we see clinically of clients really reporting hair pulling episodes as feeling automatic or when you're emotionally numb. And then interestingly, they found that childhood trauma, so especially emotional abuse, that was strongly correlated with with higher dissociation. So they found that the more emotional abuse someone experienced, the more likely they were to have dissociative symptoms. And this was actually especially true for people with trichotillomania. And then they also found that, though this is just interesting, that people with high dissociation were significantly more likely to report, in addition, kleptomania or stealing, and depersonalization disorder. Both which both of these difficulties involve impulse control. And so this kind of can point to maybe some overlap in the mechanisms around, again, emotion regulation, impulsivity, dissociation. So important here is that dissociation was not associated with how severe the hair pulling was, or how disabling or how impaired this mm, im- impaired someone's functioning in their day-to-day life. So again, this is saying that dissociation isn't about symptom intensity, it's about how the person experiences those symptoms. So um basically they said that the findings support the idea of this dissociative subtype of trichotillomania, but they said that it's not this dissociation isn't universal, and they said that not everyone who pulls their hair has trauma or dissociation, and not all trauma leads to pulling. So again, this kind of just like helps us think a bit more diverse. The picture is very complex, diverse. It looks different for everyone. We can look at different dimensions, different subtypes. And this is helpful if we want to try and tailor some treatment, some interventions to help different people. And so to get kind of a clearer picture of an individual's specific trichotillomania. Okay, so now that brings us directly into healing. So we looked at trauma, we looked at regulation, and we looked at behavior, and we saw how they're all connected. So now let's look about healing. So something that I like to say is that we're not looking about perfection, but we're looking for to learn new tools, we're learning to gain higher awareness, and we want to deepen our connection with ourselves. Okay, so first we basically we've seen how trichotillomania often functions as a maladaptive coping mechanism, something that people use to soothe themselves, to escape overwhelming emotions, to ground yourself when you feel disconnected, maybe to feel something when you're otherwise numb, to, like we said, get back into the window of tolerance when you're hyper or hypo aroused. So instead of viewing the pulling as irrational or self-destructive, self-injurious, like we said at the beginning, we can look at it as a form of regulation that made sense in the moment, especially if you didn't have other tools that were available. So what's important is to look at healing then, not as a way of forcing yourself to stop, quit cold turkey. We want to we want to learn new ways to regulate ourselves. So ways that work with your nervous system as opposed to against it. We want to learn and build new coping mechanisms. So really, this is the heart of trauma-enforced recovery. It's to start with safety and not with shame, and to learn how to respond to your needs with compassion, to respond with safety, and to then have a choice in how you respond to different things as opposed to automatically going to your hair pulling. So we're not going to get too much into the specific tools. Last month, I actually did a whole webinar on building your own toolkit to help with hair pulling. So you can go look on our YouTube channel specifically for that one. But I'll just get into some highlights here. So healing really isn't just about, like I said, stopping the behavior. We want to give the nervous system some newer, safer, healthier ways to regulate. So the first thing that we like to talk about is somatic tools. So things like breath work, tapping. So in the last month's webinar, we went over the butterfly hug. That's a very common one used often in trauma-enforced therapy. Great tool for dealing with trichotillomania. Things like grounding through the senses, looking around the room and naming maybe 5 things that you see, 4 things that you hear, 3 things that you touch, 2 things that you smell, 1 thing that you taste. That's a great tool to ground yourself through the senses. And these somatic tools are all things that can really help bring the body back into the sense of the state of balance. Again, think into the window of tolerance. And that's talking about the body, especially when words or logic aren't connecting, aren't reaching us. Because these are practices that really they speak directly to the nervous system. And what they do is they help you feel present and safe enough to kind of pause and then choose how you're able to then respond, as opposed to automatically going into, for example, pulling. Another tool or type of tool category we say is to interrupt kind of the dissociation. So gently, cold water, going to take a cold shower, ice bath if you're into it and brave. um, Naming objects around you, maybe looking around the room and naming 5 things that are white. That's a very easy thing to do. Orienting to your environment, to your space, maybe simply sitting and just describing in your head or out loud, okay, I see a screen, I see I see the park, I see the coffee shop, and then describing the scene that you see. Those are things that kind of can help you interrupt the dissociation, help you kind of reconnect with yourself. Maybe when you start to drift or you kind of feel shut down or numb. And then the last set of tools really are, maybe most importantly, are about self-compassion. A lot of people feel and carry deep, deep shame around their pulling. Shame fuels the pulling cycle. So this is something that we really want to work on. And when we can soften towards ourselves, even when we're struggling, maybe especially when we're struggling, that's really when you can create meaningful change. And then building acceptance. So acceptance doesn't mean giving up. Doesn't mean, okay, I'm giving up. I'm accepting the fact that I pull. Accepting means saying, I am doing the best that I can with the tools that I have. And I'm also allowed to learn new ones. So again, all of this isn't about forcing yourself to stop pulling. It's really about kind of slowly, also kindly with compassion, expanding your ability to stay connected to your body, to your emotions, and also to your choices, how choosing also how you respond to things. Okay, so what does progress look like? So when you've been stuck in a pulling cycle or a cycle for a long time, pulling either to soothe or to escape or to regulate, it's so natural to want change immediately. Unfortunately, progress doesn't usually mean in this work, I stopped pulling completely. More often, it means, okay, I noticed the urge a little bit earlier. Maybe I paused, uh, even just for a moment. Maybe I pulled less, or I understood more about why I pulled. So these are all extremely meaningful steps in healing. And then healing from trauma and kind of learning new regulation tools, it takes time. And why does this take time? Because you're literally rewiring your nervous system in order to find safety. Remember, we said that the nervous system is always scanning for danger or safety. So you're literally rewiring your nervous system to find safety in new ways through different coping mechanisms. And so the goal here, like I said, it's not about being perfect, finding perfection. It's again trying to build more choice, feeling more connected to your body, feeling less shame, having more curiosity, more choice. So kind of instead of asking, okay, did I stop pulling today? Ask yourself, did I feel more aware? Did I treat myself with more kindness? Maybe did I come back to myself a little bit faster? That's what real change looks like. Okay, so let's bring this all together. So we started off by unpacking what trauma really is. So it's not just the event that happened, but it's really about how it impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, to feel safe um, in the present moment today. And so for many people with trichotillomania, trauma or chronic stress might shape kind of the emotional environment, or like we said, the emotional landscape where pulling begins. So then we saw that we looked at the body's role, so how pulling can kind of serve as a form of self-regulation, maybe in a moment where you feel overwhelmed, you feel numb, you feel disconnected. And then we talked about how it's not about causing harm, it's not about self-injury, it's about soothing, focusing, maybe feeling something, anything when things feel out of reach. So again, like bringing back into the window of tolerance. We also looked at emotional triggers and trauma-related themes, things like perfectionism. We talked about shame and control. And we looked about how these kind of emotional triggers can show up right before or right after pulling, and how it's important to become aware of these patterns for yourself. And then we looked at some research and we saw a picture that's pretty clear that trauma isn't directly responsible for pulling, but what it can be is an indirect connection that through from trauma can lead to low mood and impulsivity and dissociation, all three of which can make pulling more likely. So again, like we said, pulling, it's a coping strategy. It's not a defect. It's a we said then that healing uh it means learning new tools. We're trying to reframe it. It's not about forcing yourself to stop cold turkey, stopping the behavior, but it's about gently, with compassion, kindly to yourself, learning and building new ways to respond to your inner world. So to learn new tools that kind of bring you back into connecting with your body, connecting with your emotions, and like we said, also connecting with your choices and having the ability to choose how you respond. Okay, so I just before we get into the Q&A, I want to just highlight that we have free resources from TrickStop. So we have for subscribers and non-subscribers. So really, we encourage everyone to use them. So we have monthly webinars, and you can check out our YouTube channel. If you just look up TrickStop on our YouTube channel on YouTube, you can find them, and our past ones are recorded and we upload them there. So like I said, for example, building your own not BFRB, we did them separately for we did the one for trichotillomania. That's there, and you can learn specific tools. We practice them together. And then you can look on our website. There's a lot of information there, lots of articles in our blog. And then finally, I really encourage you guys to follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, X. Really, these are great opportunities for community. It's a great source there, source of information, treatment options. So definitely encourage that. And um, here, if you want any to ask any questions, for our customer support about the program, you can email us at support@trickstop.com. Or if you have any more clinical questions, you can ask me, Maya at helpingminds.com. And like I promised, here is the promo code PROWUB100 for a $100 discount for your first month when signing up. Okay, so we have a few minutes, like I said, for Q&A. So let's get into that. Okay. Somebody said, what if I only pull out thick dark hairs around my neck, chest, and stomach, not hair on my head? I don't use tweezers, just my hands, which sometimes leaves my skin red and irritated. I still feel good when I pull it out successfully. So yeah, that could be a form of a coping mechanism. Like you're describing, the feeling of good, the feeling of satisfaction. Um, and yeah, if it's leaving your skin red and irritated, then maybe it could be something that you want to stop if you're doing it as a coping mechanism, as a way to feel good. And maybe you could look at finding newer, better, healthier ways of emotionally regulating. Great. Somebody asked, does parents not understanding or not caring to understand why their child has trichotillomania affect the child's response slash self-image? Um, that's a huge question. I think it definitely could. Um, I think you're asking about really if a parent isn't in touch with their child, if they're not maybe helping them with finding the right coping mechanisms, right? Because if we're framing trichotillomania as a way of coping with really difficult emotions, and the parents are, like you're saying, not caring or not caring to understand, then it's almost like they're saying, I don't care about your negative emotions. So it is definitely something. And we actually have a parent program. Um, sorry, I see my if I'm delayed, sorry. We have a parent program, so you can definitely send us an email if you want to hear more about it, or look up Trick Stop Parent Program, and you could get some information for the parents there. Next question. Thank you for outlining the different types of trauma. I think my child experienced chronic trauma from her experience in school, being severely dyslexic, but undiagnosed for her first 5 years of school. Her polling started around 8 years old. She's now 11. She was diagnosed at 10. Trick seems to be so difficult to treat and is so distressing for her, despite almost 2 years of psychotherapy. Have you seen this before in children? Is there any specific approach you would suggest for this type of trauma related to Trick? So, first of all, amazing that she's in therapy. I think that's says a lot about how proactive you are about this. If you yourself would like, I also just mentioned this, but if you yourself would like some more support, we have a parent program specifically about trichotillomania, and then you could ask your therapist there to get more in depth about how you view your child's trauma, um, daughter's trauma, um, and then go more in depth to, like we said, it's so diverse, and to understand the specific case, you need to go into it with a therapist. So if you go into our program, then you'll be guided by a therapist, and then you could work on that specifically. Um, okay, there's lots of questions. I don't think we're gonna get to all of them, but we have time for some more. Does trichotillomania and having an eating disorder overlap? And if so, how is it connected? That's a great question. So, we said today that there's some research showing connection about impulsivity. Um, that's definitely related. Like we said in one of the articles, they talked about overeating. Um, that is a great question. I actually don't know the specific statistics about comorbidity or co-occurrence of eating disorders and trichotillomania, but I could look into that. So send me an email if you want me to look into those specifically. Next question. Whenever I pull, I actually feel like it's mindless when I'm watching TV, for example. I know I often live in a hyperarousal state, but does this sound like I flip to a hypoarousal state when it's happening? Often don't even realize I'm doing it until after I've been doing it for a while. This is a common comment that a lot of our clients say. We call this automatic pulling. And so, yes, it definitely could be that you're in a hypoarousal state, and that's when the pulling happens. It could be a way of just trying to feel something when you're in that state, and your nervous system is just always, if you're not always, but often in this hyperarousal state. If you're very anxious, very stressed, then all of a sudden you become dissociated and checked out, and it can be that's maybe when it's arising. So yes, so are there other subtypes of trick aside from dissociative? This seems to be connected to hypoarousal. Is there one connected to hyperarousal? So yes, so we talk about like I just said, automatic versus focused pulling. So focused pulling, often clients describe the feeling of needing to all of a sudden pull to feel calm after an urge arose. It could be triggered by overwhelm of stress, feeling extreme hyperarousal, anxious, on edge, and then the feeling of the pulling helps to calm down. So definitely that could be the more focused pulling. Somebody asked, I noticed some light lip biting during the presentation. Is that because this is a bit overwhelming for me? Is this related to pulling? So lip biting, cheek biting, those are definitely cousins of trichotillomania. It's under the umbrella of BFRB, or body focused repetitive behaviors. You can definitely look on our website. We have a lot of information all about that. And yeah, it definitely could be related. It's kind of another form of your body doing something automatically, especially if this is a lot of information. So definitely, like we said, self-compassion, take it with a deep breath, and okay, this is a lot of information. So I'm happy that you said that you can acknowledge that this is overwhelming. Somebody asked, have you seen people who focus their pulling only on split ends? I personally haven't seen clients with that, but I have heard that um that is maybe a subtype or a tendency for sure. Um, Okay, I don't think we have any more time, and there are a lot of questions. I really want to suggest that you guys send us emails to my, if you have a clinical question, you can send it to me, my@helpingminds.com, or if you have more of a question about the program, definitely send it to support@trickstop.com. But thank you guys all for attending. And we will be in touch if you have more questions. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.